The gunshot that rang through Williams, Arizona territory on that scorching afternoon in July 1881, missed Clara Greene by mere inches, shattering the glass window of Henderson's Mercantile and sending her sprawling backward into a tower of carefully wrapped parcels she had spent the entire morning preparing. Brown paper flew everywhere, twine unraveling across the wooden floor as Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the floorboards and tried to catch her breath. "Get down!" A voice bellowed from outside, and Clara flattened herself against the floor, her cheek pressed against the rough wood that still smelled of the morning sweeping. More shots rang out, but these were farther away now, moving down Main Street toward the saloon. Clara could hear shouting, the thunder of hooves, and then slowly, gradually, silence settled over the afternoon like dust after a storm. She lay there for what felt like hours but could only have been minutes, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her mind racing with questions. Were the bandits gone? Was anyone hurt? Should she move or stay hidden? The decision was made for her when the door to the Mercantile swung open with such force it banged against the wall and heavy footsteps crossed the threshold. "Miss, you all right in there?" The voice was different now, concerned rather than commanding, with a slight drawl that marked the speaker as someone who had spent considerable time under the southwestern sun. Clara lifted her head cautiously, blinking away the dust that had settled in her eyes, and found herself staring at a pair of well-worn leather boots, dusty denim trousers, and finally, as her gaze traveled upward, the face of a man who looked like he had ridden straight out of one of those dime novels her friend Martha was always reading. He was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of the Arizona sky just before sunset, that deep blue that seemed to hold both warmth and mystery. His hat hung down his back by its cord, revealing dark hair dampened with sweat, and when he crouched down beside her, Clara noticed the way his hand rested naturally on the revolver at his hip, as though it were as much a part of him as his own arm. "I am fine," Clara managed, though her voice came out shakier than she would have liked. "Just startled." "What happened?" "Riley gang tried to rob the bank. Sheriff got word this morning they were heading this way, so we were ready for them." He extended his hand toward her, and Clara took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip as he helped her to her feet. "Name's Preston Hardy. I ride with Sheriff Coleman when there is trouble brewing." Clara brushed at her skirt, sending up little clouds of dust, and tried to compose herself. At 23, she had been working at Henderson's Mercantile for nearly 2 years since arriving in Williams from Missouri. And in all that time, nothing more exciting than old Mr. Peterson's mule getting loose had disturbed the peace. "Clara Greene," she said, finally meeting his eyes properly. "I wrap parcels here at the Mercantile, among other things, of course." Preston's mouth quirked into something that might have been a smile. "Well, Miss Greene, looks like you will be wrapping them all over again." He gestured to the chaos of paper and twine scattered across the floor, the packages she had so carefully prepared now crushed beneath her fall. "I am real sorry about the window, too. We tried to keep them away from the shops, but Bill Riley never was much for consideration. Is anyone hurt?" Clara asked, suddenly remembering that other people might not have been as fortunate as she was in avoiding the gunfire. "Frank Wilson took a bullet in the shoulder, but Doc Andrews says he will be fine. We got 2 of the Riley boys in custody, and the rest lit out toward Flagstaff. Sheriff is organizing a posse to go after them." Preston bent down and picked up one of the crushed parcels, examining it with what seemed like genuine interest. "This was supposed to be Mrs. Henderson's dress fabric, wasn't it? I remember her going on about some special silk that was coming in from California." Clara was surprised he had noticed such a detail. Most of the cowboys and ranchers who came through Williams barely looked at what was on the Mercantile shelves, let alone remembered who had ordered what. "You have a good memory," she said, taking the package from him and sighing at its battered state. "Yes, it arrived last week. She will be disappointed it got damaged." "Not as disappointed as she would be if you had gotten hurt," Preston said, and there was something in his tone that made Clara look at him more carefully. He was watching her with an intensity that seemed at odds with his casual stance, as though he were trying to figure out a puzzle. "You have been in Williams about 2 years now, right? Came from St. Louis, Jefferson City," Clara corrected automatically, then frowned. "How did you know I was from Missouri at all?" Preston had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Small town. People talk. And I might have asked Mr. Henderson about you a few months back when I was buying supplies." The implications of that statement hung in the air between them, and Clara felt heat rising to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun streaming through the broken window. Before she could formulate a response, Mr. Henderson himself came bustling through the door, his round face flushed with excitement and concern. "Clara, thank heavens you are safe. I saw the broken window from down the street and feared the worst." He paused, taking in the scene, his gaze moving from Clara to Preston and back again. "Preston, good to see you, boy. I heard you were instrumental in running off those bandits. Sheriff Coleman is lucky to have you." "Just doing what needed doing, sir." Preston touched 2 fingers to where the brim of his hat would have been if he had been wearing it properly. "I should get back out there. Just wanted to make sure Miss Greene was unharmed." "Very thoughtful of you," Mr. Henderson said, and Clara could hear the knowing tone in his voice that made her want to roll her eyes. Her employer had been trying to match her with various eligible men in Williams since approximately 3 days after she had started working for him. "Clara, why do not you take the rest of the afternoon off? I can see to cleaning up this mess." "I cannot just leave you with all this work," Clara protested, but Mr. Henderson was already waving away her objections. "Nonsense. You have had a shock. Go home, have some tea, rest. Besides, I need to board up that window before we can do much else, and that is not work for a lady in a dress." He turned to Preston. "Would you mind seeing Clara safely home? I know it is just down the street, but after all this excitement, I would feel better knowing someone was looking after her." Clara opened her mouth to say she was perfectly capable of walking 3 blocks on her own, but Preston was already nodding. "Be my pleasure, sir." And so Clara found herself being escorted out of the Mercantile and into the bright afternoon sun, her hand resting lightly on Preston's arm because it would have been rude to refuse the gesture, her mind whirling with questions and observations. The street was more crowded than usual, with people emerging from their homes and businesses now that the danger had passed, everyone talking at once about the attempted robbery and the brave men who had defended their town. "You did not have to do this," Clara said as they walked. "I know you have responsibilities with the sheriff." "Those responsibilities include making sure citizens get home safe," Preston replied, but there was something playful in his tone that suggested duty was not his only motivation. "Besides, I meant what I said back in the Mercantile. I have been wanting to talk to you properly for a while now, but every time I come into Henderson's, you are always so busy with customers or wrapping those parcels of yours." Clara looked at him sideways, noting the way the sunlight caught in his dark hair, the strong line of his jaw. "So you used a bank robbery as an excuse to finally have a conversation." That earned her a genuine laugh, warm and rich. "Not quite how I planned it, but I will take what opportunities the good Lord provides." They had reached the boarding house where Clara rented a room, a neat 2-story building run by Mrs. Walsh, a widow who kept a respectable establishment for working women. Preston stopped at the gate, his expression growing more serious. "Truth is, Miss Greene, I would like to call on you proper-like, if you would permit it. Maybe take you to the church social next Saturday." Clara's heart did a complicated dance in her chest. She had noticed Preston before, of course. It was impossible not to notice a man like him in a town the size of Williams, but she had never imagined he had taken any particular interest in her. She was just the woman who wrapped parcels at the Mercantile, nothing special, nothing remarkable. "I do not know much about you," she heard herself say, even as part of her wanted to immediately say yes. "Only that you ride with the sheriff sometimes and you have a good memory for dress fabric orders." Preston's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Fair point. How about this, then? You know where the Hardy Ranch is, about 5 miles south of town. That is my family's place. My father started it back in '68, and now my older brother runs the cattle operation while I help out and do work for the sheriff when needed. I am 26 years old. I do not drink to excess. I attend church most Sundays when I am not tracking outlaws, and I think you are the prettiest, most capable woman I have ever had the fortune to meet." The directness of his words left Clara momentarily speechless. She was used to the awkward, fumbling attempts at courtship that most men engaged in, not this straightforward honesty that seemed to be Preston's natural way. "You barely know me," she finally said. "Which is why I would like to court you proper," Preston said patiently, "so I can know you better." "So you can know me, unless you are already spoken for, or just not interested." Clara thought about her life in Williams, the quiet routine of her days at the Mercantile, the evenings spent in her small room reading or sewing or writing letters to her sister back in Missouri. She thought about how she had come west looking for something different, something more than what her small hometown could offer, though she had never quite articulated what that something might be. And she thought about how Preston Hardy was looking at her right now, as though her answer actually mattered to him, as though she were someone worth pursuing. "I am not spoken for," she said quietly, "and I would be pleased to accompany you to the church social, Mr. Hardy." The smile that spread across Preston's face was like sunrise, bright and warm and full of promise. "Preston," he said, "please. Mr. Hardy is my father, and he is a cantankerous old cowhand who would probably try to rope you into helping with the spring branding if he thought he could get away with it." Clara laughed despite herself. "All right then, Preston. And you should call me Clara if we are going to be attending church socials together." "Clara," he repeated, and she liked the way her name sounded in his voice, soft and careful, as though it were something precious. "I will come by for you around 6 on Saturday, if that suits." "That suits fine." Preston tipped his hat to her, the gesture somehow both old-fashioned and charming, and then he was walking back toward Main Street, his long stride covering the ground quickly. Clara stood at the gate watching him go, her hand pressed against her chest where her heart was still beating faster than normal, wondering what exactly had just happened to her carefully ordered life. Mrs. Walsh was waiting in the parlor when Clara entered, her knitting needles clicking away as she worked on what looked like another pair of socks for her grandson. "Heard there was trouble in town," the older woman said without looking up. "Glad to see you are in one piece. Also noticed you had an escort home. That Preston Hardy?" "Yes, madam." Clara knew better than to try to keep secrets in a boarding house. Mrs. Walsh had a network of information that would put a telegraph operator to shame. Good family, the Hardys. Preston's father served in the war, came out here afterward looking for a fresh start. Built that ranch up from nothing. Preston is the youngest of 3 boys, and from what I hear, the only one with any real sense. His oldest brother Thomas runs the ranch. Middle brother died a few years back in a riding accident. Tragic business. Mrs. Walsh finally looked up, her sharp eyes assessing Clara with the kind of thoroughness that came from decades of observing human nature. He has been sweet on you for a while, you know. Asks about you every time he sees me at the general store. Clara felt her cheeks warming again. He asked to court me, said he would take me to the church social on Saturday. And you said yes, I hope. Clara Greene, you are a sensible girl, but sometimes sensible gets in the way of living. That man is one of the good ones, and good ones do not come along every day, especially not out here. Mrs. Walsh set down her knitting with an air of finality. Now, I imagine you have had quite the shock today. Why do not you go rest for a while? I will bring up some tea and something to eat in a bit. Clara gratefully accepted the suggestion and climbed the stairs to her room, a modest space with a single window overlooking the back garden, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk that held all her worldly possessions. It was not much, but it was hers, paid for with her own wages, and that meant something. She had come west to be independent, to make her own way in the world rather than accepting the marriage proposal from Thomas Whitmore, the banker's son back in Jefferson City, who had expected her to be grateful for his interest, despite his wandering eye and his tendency to drink too much at social functions. She sat on the edge of her bed and unpinned her hair, letting it fall down her back in waves the color of honey. Her hands were still shaking slightly when she held them up to examine them, the physical aftermath of fear and excitement, and something else she could not quite name. Preston Hardy wanted to court her. Preston Hardy, who apparently had been interested in her for months while she had been obliviously wrapping parcels and measuring out flour and making polite conversation with customers. The week that followed passed in a strange blur of normalcy and anticipation. The broken window at the Mercantile was replaced, the crushed parcels were rewrapped, and life in Williams returned to its usual rhythm. Sheriff Coleman and his posse caught up with the remaining Riley gang members near Flagstaff, and the whole lot of them were hauled off to the territorial prison. Frank Wilson recovered from his shoulder wound and was back to work at the feed store within days, sporting his bandage like a badge of honor, and telling increasingly embellished versions of the shootout to anyone who would listen. Preston came by the Mercantile twice during the week, once to buy tobacco for his father and once for a sack of sugar that Clara suspected he did not really need. Each time, he made a point of talking to her, asking about her day, making her laugh with stories about ranch life. She learned that he had a horse named Pepper who was stubborn as a mule but loyal to a fault, that his favorite food was his mother's apple pie, that he had taught himself to read using an old copy of Shakespeare his mother had brought from back east, and that he had once wanted to be a lawyer until his brother's death had brought him back to the ranch permanently. In return, she told him about growing up in Missouri, about her father who had died when she was 16, and her mother who had remarried within a year to a man Clara could not stand, about her younger sister Emma, who had just turned 20, and was engaged to a shopkeeper in Jefferson City, about how she had taken the train west almost on a whim, following a newspaper advertisement for workers needed in the Arizona Territory. She told him about her love of reading, her secret attempts at writing poetry, her dream of maybe one day owning her own shop, though she knew that was probably foolish thinking for a woman alone. Preston did not think it was foolish. He listened to everything she said with that same focused attention he seemed to bring to all things, and when she finished talking, he said, "I think you could do anything you set your mind to, Clara Greene. You are that kind of person." It was such a simple statement, but it meant more to her than all the flowery compliments she had ever received from men who were trying to charm their way into her good graces. By the time Saturday arrived, Clara was more nervous than she could ever remember being. She changed her dress 3 times before settling on a simple blue cotton that Mrs. Walsh assured her brought out her eyes. She pinned her hair up carefully, leaving a few tendrils loose around her face, and studied her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. She was not a great beauty, she knew that. Her nose was too straight, her mouth too wide, her eyes too serious. But Preston Hardy did not seem to mind any of that, and perhaps that was what mattered. He arrived precisely at 6, driving a small wagon that looked freshly cleaned, his own clothes neat and dust-free, his dark hair still damp as though he had just bathed. The sight of him made Clara's heart do that complicated dance again, and she had to remind herself to breathe normally as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made it impossible not to believe him. The church social was held in the churchyard, with tables set up under the cottonwood trees and lanterns hung from the branches to provide light as evening fell. It seemed like half the town had turned out, families and couples and groups of young people all mingling together, the air filled with the smell of home-cooked food and the sound of fiddle music. Clara had been to these socials before, usually helping Mrs. Walsh carry food or standing on the edges watching other people dance, but this time was different. This time, she was here with Preston, and he made it clear through every word and gesture that he was proud to have her on his arm. He introduced her to his father, a grizzled man in his 50s with the same blue eyes as his son and a handshake like iron, and his sister-in-law Rebecca, Thomas's wife, a friendly woman with 3 small children who immediately demanded Uncle Preston's attention. Clara watched as Preston scooped up the youngest, a little girl of about 3, and carried her around on his shoulders, his laughter mixing with the child's delighted shrieks. The sight of it made something in Clara's chest tighten with an emotion she did not want to examine too closely. They ate together, sharing a plate of fried chicken and potato salad and fresh baked bread, sitting on a blanket Preston had brought and spread out under one of the cottonwoods. They talked about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing as easily as water, and Clara realized with something like wonder that she felt completely comfortable with this man she barely knew. There was no need to pretend or perform, no pressure to be anything other than herself. When the dancing started, Preston led her onto the makeshift dance floor, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers gently but firmly. Clara was not an experienced dancer, but Preston was patient, guiding her through the steps of a simple waltz, not seeming to mind when she stepped on his toes or lost the rhythm. "I am terrible at this," she said apologetically as they turned in a slow circle. "You are doing fine," Preston assured her. "Besides, this gives me an excuse to hold you close, so I am not complaining." Clara felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she was smiling too, unable to help herself. "You are very forward, Preston Hardy." "Life is too short to be anything else," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "I learned that when my brother died. Daniel was always the careful one, always planning for the future, always putting things off until later. And then one day there was no later. So I decided I was going to be honest about what I want, and what I want, Clara, is to get to know you better. I want to court you proper, and if you will let me, I want to see where this goes between us." The music swirled around them, and Clara was aware of other couples dancing nearby, of curious eyes watching them, of the way the lantern light cast shadows across Preston's face. She thought about Thomas Whitmore back in Missouri, about how he had proposed to her in the most perfunctory way possible, as though he were conducting a business transaction rather than asking someone to share his life. She thought about how she had said no, how she had left everything familiar behind to come west, and how that decision had led her here to this moment, to this man. "I want that too," she whispered, and the smile Preston gave her was worth every mile she had traveled to get to Williams, Arizona territory. The summer weeks that followed were the happiest Clara had ever known. Preston called on her regularly, always respectful of propriety, always mindful of her reputation. He took her on picnics out to the red rock formations that dotted the landscape around Williams, spreading blankets in the shade while they talked for hours. He showed her his family's ranch, introducing her to his horse Pepper, and the small herd of cattle that were the Hardy family's livelihood. He took her to the traveling theater company that came through town in August, sitting beside her in the makeshift theater and holding her hand in the darkness while actors performed a melodrama about star-crossed lovers. In turn, Clara found herself opening up to Preston in ways she never had with anyone else. She told him about the loneliness she had felt growing up after her father died, about how her mother's remarriage had made her feel like an intruder in her own home. She told him about her complicated feelings toward her sister Emma, loving her fiercely while also envying the ease with which Emma seemed to navigate life and relationships. She told him about the fear that had driven her west, the fear that if she stayed in Jefferson City, she would end up settling for a life she did not truly want, married to a man she did not truly love, slowly suffocating under the weight of should and must and ought. Preston listened to all of it, never judging, never dismissing her feelings as feminine hysteria or dramatic foolishness, the way some men would have. Instead, he shared his own fears and doubts, talking about how he sometimes worried he was not doing enough to help his father and brother with the ranch, about how he had struggled after Daniel's death with anger and guilt, about how being a deputy for the sheriff gave him a sense of purpose, but also scared him because he knew how quickly things could go wrong in a gunfight. That day at the Mercantile, Clara said one afternoon in September as they sat by a small creek on the Hardy property, their boots off and their feet dangling in the cold water, "When you came in after the shooting stopped, were you scared?" Preston considered the question carefully, the way he always did before answering anything serious. Yes and no. In the moment when everything is happening, there is not really time for fear. You just act, do what needs doing. But afterward, when I saw you lying there on the floor surrounded by all that broken glass, my heart just about stopped. I realized that you could have been hurt, could have been killed, and I had not even told you how I felt about you yet. That scared me more than any outlaw ever could. Clara reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I am glad you were not hurt either. When I heard your voice telling people to get down, I did not know who you were, but I felt safer somehow. And then when you came in and helped me up, I just remember thinking how steady you were, how calm. I did not feel calm. I felt like my chest was going to explode." Preston squeezed her hand gently. "Clara, I need to tell you something, and I hope it does not scare you off." Her heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "I am falling in love with you." The words came out quiet but firm, and Preston turned to look at her directly, his blue eyes serious. "I know we have not been courting that long, and maybe it is too soon to say such things, but I meant what I told you at the church social. Life is too short not to be honest. You are the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing on my mind before I sleep. When I am working cattle or riding with the sheriff, I find myself wondering what you are doing, whether you are laughing at something Mr. Henderson said or concentrating on wrapping one of those perfect parcels of yours. I love the way you think about things, the way you see the world. I love your strength and your kindness and your sharp wit. And I needed you to know that, even if it is too soon, even if you do not feel the same way yet." Clara's eyes were stinging with tears she did not entirely understand, happy tears mixed with something deeper and more profound. "It is not too soon," she managed. "Preston, I feel the same way. I have been trying trying to be sensible about it, because this was not what I came west looking for. I came here to be independent, to prove I did not need a man to define my life. But then you walked into the Mercantile with your concern and your honesty and your terrible excuse about needing sugar, and suddenly everything changed. I love you too." Preston's face lit up with joy so pure it took Clara's breath away. He pulled her close, and she went willingly, feeling his arms around her, strong and safe and exactly where she wanted to be. When he kissed her, soft and sweet there by the creek with the Arizona sun warm on their backs, Clara felt like she had finally found what she had been searching for without even knowing it. This connection, this rightness, this sense of coming home to a place she had never been before. "Marry me," Preston said against her hair, and Clara pulled back to look at him in astonishment. "Right now? You are proposing right now, tomorrow, next week? I do not care about the timing, Clara. I just know I want to spend my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and come home to you every evening. I want to build something with you, a real partnership. I know I am not rich, and ranch life can be hard, but I promise I will do everything in my power to make you happy." Clara laughed through her tears, overwhelmed and overjoyed and more certain of this than she had been of anything in her life. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Preston Hardy." They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Williams, with what seemed like half the town in attendance. Clara wore a dress she had sewn herself from ivory-colored silk, simple but elegant, with pearl buttons down the back that Mrs. Walsh and Martha from the boarding house had helped her fasten. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Preston had picked that morning, and when she walked down the aisle and saw him waiting for her at the altar, his face full of love and wonder, she knew she had made the right choice in coming west, in taking a chance on this new life. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, with Reverend Thompson keeping his remarks mercifully brief. And then Preston was kissing her, really kissing her this time in front of God and everybody, and Clara did not care who was watching because she was Mrs. Preston Hardy now, and that meant everything. The reception was held at the Hardy Ranch, with tables set up in the yard and more food than Clara had ever seen in one place. Thomas and Rebecca had organized everything, clearly delighted to welcome Clara into the family officially. Preston's father, normally so gruff and taciturn, actually got a little misty-eyed when he toasted the happy couple, talking about how proud he was of his youngest son and how lucky Preston was to have found a woman of character and strength. "You take care of my boy," he said gruffly to Clara later, pulling her aside while Preston was distracted by well-wishers. "He acts tough, but he has got a soft heart. Lost a lot when we lost Daniel. Having you in his life, it has brought him back to himself. So thank you for that." Clara hugged her new father-in-law, feeling his surprise and then his acceptance as he patted her back awkwardly. "I will take care of him," she promised, "and he takes care of me too. That is what love is supposed to be, I think, taking care of each other." The party lasted well into the evening, with dancing and drinking and more laughter than Clara had heard in one place since leaving Missouri. When the moon was high and the guests finally began to drift home, Preston took Clara's hand and led her away from the main house to a smaller building about 100 yards away, a cabin that had been Daniel's before he died, and that Preston had spent the last several weeks fixing up and furnishing. "I wanted us to have our own place," he explained as he opened the door and lit the lantern inside, revealing a space that was small but carefully appointed, with a real bed covered in a beautiful quilt that Rebecca had made, a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, and even a bookshelf already half full of volumes. I know it is not much compared to some places, but it is ours. We can add to it over time, maybe build on a room or two when we need more space. When we need more space. The implication of children, of a future together, made Clara's heart swell with happiness. "It is perfect," she said honestly. "Preston, this is more than I ever dreamed of." He pulled her close, his hands gentle as they began working on those pearl buttons, his lips trailing kisses along her neck and shoulder as each button came free. "Let me show you just how perfect it can be, Mrs. Hardy." And he did, with tenderness and passion, initiating Clara into the physical mysteries of marriage with patience and care, making sure she felt loved and cherished and desired. It was overwhelming and wonderful and a little awkward in the way first times always are, but through it all Clara felt safe with Preston, knowing he would never hurt her, never take more than she was willing to give. When they finally lay together afterward, tangled in sheets in each other, Clara traced patterns on Preston's chest and marveled at how her life had changed in just a few short months. "What are you thinking about?" Preston asked, his voice drowsy in content. "About that day at the Mercantile. About how I was just wrapping parcels, doing my job, and then suddenly my whole world shifted. If those outlaws had not tried to rob the bank, would you have ever worked up the nerve to talk to me?" Preston laughed softly. "Eventually. Though I will admit, having a crisis to respond to made it easier to be bold. I had been working on a speech for months, trying to figure out the right way to approach you without sounding like an idiot." "What was the speech?" "Something awkward about how I came into the Mercantile one day to buy rope and instead got all tied up watching you work." He groaned at his own terrible wordplay. "See, it was awful. The bank robbery was actually a blessing in disguise because it meant I just had to be honest instead of trying to be clever." Clara laughed and kissed him, tasting joy and promise on his lips. "For what it is worth, I think that speech might have worked on me anyway. I have always been a sucker for terrible puns. Good to know." Preston pulled her closer, arranging the blankets around them against the cool night air. "Get some sleep, love. Tomorrow we start our real life together, and I promise you it is going to be an adventure." He was right about the adventure part, though neither of them could have predicted exactly what form it would take. Clara continued working at the Mercantile for a few months after the wedding, partly because they needed the money and partly because she genuinely enjoyed the work. But as winter approached and she started feeling tired and nauseated in the mornings, Mrs. Walsh took one look at her and pronounced what Clara had already begun to suspect. "You are with child, dear. I have seen enough pregnancies in my day to recognize the signs. Have you told Preston yet?" Clara shook her head, one hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. "I wanted to be sure first, but I think you are right. I have been keeping track and I am late, and the smell of coffee makes me want to be sick even though I used to love it. He is going to be over the moon, Mrs. Walsh predicted, and she was absolutely correct. When Clara told Preston that evening, presenting him with a tiny pair of knitted booties that Mrs. Walsh had given her, he picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests, his face transformed with delight. "We are having a baby." "Truly?" He set her down carefully as though she were suddenly made of glass. "When are you feeling all right? Do you need to sit down? Should I get the doctor?" Preston breathed. Clara took his hands, grounding him. "I am fine. The baby should come in early summer, probably June if I am calculating correctly. And yes, we are truly having a baby. You are going to be a father." The wonder in Preston's eyes was something Clara knew she would remember for the rest of her life. He sank down onto his knees in front of her, pressing his face against her stomach, his arms wrapping around her waist. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for this, for everything, for being mine." "We are each other's," Clara corrected gently, running her fingers through his hair. "That is the whole point." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months, with Clara eventually stopping work at the Mercantile in February, when her growing belly made it difficult to stand for long periods. She spent her days at the cabin, sewing baby clothes and reading, and sometimes helping Rebecca with her children when Thomas brought them over for visits. The three cousins, aged 6, 4, and 3, were wild and energetic, and Clara often thought that this was good practice for when her own child arrived. Preston was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worrying about Clara doing too much or not resting enough. She found it endearing even when it was frustrating, knowing his concern came from love. He built a beautiful wooden cradle for the baby, carving little horses into the headboard, and started making plans to add another room onto the cabin. "We will need space for more children," he said matter-of-factly one evening in March as they sat together planning the addition. "I am thinking at least 3 or 4 if you are amenable. I always wanted a big family." Clara smiled at his presumption, but she did not disagree. She had grown up with just one sibling and had often felt lonely. The idea of a house full of children, of noise and laughter and chaos, appealed to her more than she would have expected. "Let us see how this first one goes before we start planning for a whole brood," she suggested diplomatically. "Fair enough." Preston leaned over and kissed her, his hand resting on the swell of her belly where the baby was currently doing what felt like acrobatics. "But I am telling you right now, I am going to love this child more than life itself, and any brothers or sisters who might come along after." Their son was born on a sweltering day in late June, after a labor that lasted 18 hours and left Clara exhausted but triumphant. Dr. Andrews delivered the baby with Rebecca's assistance, and when Clara heard that first lusty cry, she burst into tears of relief and joy. Preston, who had been pacing outside the cabin wearing a path in the dirt, came rushing in the moment Rebecca called for him, his face pale and anxious until he saw Clara holding their son, both of them tired but healthy. "A boy," Clara said softly, looking down at the tiny red-faced creature in her arms. "We have a son, Preston." Preston sat carefully on the edge of the bed, one finger reaching out to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. The infant's fingers immediately curled around his father's finger in that instinctive grip newborns have, and Preston's face crumpled with emotion. "He is perfect," he managed. "You are perfect. I cannot believe this is real." They named him Daniel Preston Hardy, honoring Preston's lost brother while also looking forward to their son's own future. Little Daniel, or Danny as they quickly started calling him, had his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined chin, and from the very beginning he made his presence known with healthy lungs and strong opinions about when he wanted to be fed. Life settled into a new rhythm after Danny's arrival, one structured around feedings and naps and the particular needs of an infant. Clara had never been more exhausted or more happy. She loved being a mother, loved watching Preston with their son, the way his large hands were so incredibly gentle as he changed nappies or rocked Danny to sleep. Thomas and Rebecca's children were fascinated by their new cousin, constantly wanting to help or hold the baby, and the Hardy family grew even closer as they all adjusted to this new addition. But the peace they had built was shattered one afternoon in October when Preston came home earlier than expected from riding with Sheriff Coleman, his face grim in a way Clara had not seen since the day of the bank robbery. "What is wrong?" she asked immediately, her stomach clenching with worry. Preston took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of stress. "There has been some trouble. The Dalton boys have been causing problems up near Flagstaff, rustling cattle and robbing stage coaches. The territorial governor wants Sheriff Coleman to put together a special posse to track them down, and he asked me to be part of it." Clara felt fear spike through her, cold and sharp. "How long would you be gone?" "Hard to say. Could be a week, could be a month. These things have a way of taking however long they take." Preston crossed to where she stood holding Danny, wrapping his arms around both of them. "I do not want to go, Clara. The thought of leaving you and Danny makes me sick, but this is part of my responsibility as a deputy. The sheriff needs men he can trust, and I cannot let him down." Clara wanted to scream at him not to go, to beg him to stay safe at the ranch with her and their son. But she knew Preston, knew his sense of duty and honor. If she asked him to choose between that duty and his family, it would tear him apart. So instead, she took a deep breath and nodded. "When do you leave?" "Day after tomorrow. I need to get supplies together, make sure Pepper is ready for hard riding." His arms tightened around her. "Clara, if anything happens to me, I need you to know that you and Danny are provided for. The cabin is yours free and clear, and there is money saved up with Thomas. My father and brother will take care of you. I have already talked to them about it." "Nothing is going to happen to you," Clara said fiercely, even though she knew no such promises could be made. "You are going to go track down those outlaws. You are going to come home safe, and we are going to continue building our life together. That is what is going to happen, Preston Hardy, because I refuse to accept any other outcome." Preston kissed her then, deep and desperate, and that night they made love with an intensity born of fear and hope, and the profound need to hold onto each other against an uncertain future. He left 2 days later just after dawn, fully outfitted for what promised to be a difficult pursuit. Clara stood in the doorway of their cabin with Danny in her arms, watching Preston ride away with the rest of the posse, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared entirely into the morning haze. Only then did she let herself cry, silent tears streaming down her face as she held their son close and prayed to a God she was not entirely sure she believed in. The days that followed were some of the longest of Clara's life. She threw herself into caring for Danny and helping Rebecca with her children, anything to keep her mind occupied. But at night, lying alone in the bed she and Preston shared, her imagination ran wild with terrible possibilities. She pictured him shot by outlaws, thrown from his horse, lost in the wilderness. Every scenario seemed more horrific than the last, and she would lie awake until dawn, exhausted but unable to find peace. News trickled back slowly through the territorial telegraph system. The posse had tracked the Dalton gang to a hideout in the mountains north of Flagstaff. There had been a confrontation. Shots had been fired. 3 of the outlaws were killed, 2 were captured. And then, most terrifying of all, silence for nearly a week with no word about casualties among the lawmen. Clara was working in the garden behind the cabin when she saw the rider approaching, and her heart stopped. It was Thomas, riding fast, and she could not read his expression from a distance. She dropped the basket of vegetables she had been collecting and ran to meet him, Danny still asleep inside the cabin. "Is he alive?" she demanded before Thomas had even dismounted. "Thomas, please, just tell me if he is alive." "He is alive," Thomas said quickly, and Clara nearly collapsed with relief. "He was shot, Clara. Took a bullet in the side during the confrontation with the gang, but Dr. Andrews was with the posse and he treated Preston right away. They are on their way back now, should be here tomorrow morning. The sheriff sent word ahead so we could prepare. Shot. Preston had been shot. Clara felt like she could not breathe, like the air had turned to water in her lungs. How bad is it? Is he going to recover? The doc says the bullet went clean through, missed anything vital. Preston is weak from blood loss, but he is conscious and talking. You know him, already trying to make jokes about having a good story to tell Danny when he is older. Thomas dismounted and gripped Clara's shoulders, looking into her eyes with the same steady gaze his younger brother had inherited. He is going to be fine, Clara. Hardy men are tough as boot leather. Clara nodded, but she could not stop shaking. Thomas helped her inside and sat with her until she had calmed down enough to think clearly. Then he rode back to the main house to tell their father and Rebecca the news, promising to return the next morning when Preston arrived. Clara did not sleep that night. She prepared the cabin as best she could for an invalid, making sure they had clean bandages and water and everything Dr. Andrews might need. She cooked a pot of soup that could be easily reheated. She checked on Danny a dozen times, finding comfort in his peaceful sleeping face, this tiny person who looked so much like his father. And she prayed, really prayed for the first time since she was a child, begging for Preston's recovery, promising anything if he would just be all right. The sun had barely risen when she heard the sound of wagon wheels and horses. Clara was outside instantly, running toward the small group making their way up to the cabin. Preston was lying in the back of a wagon on a makeshift bed of blankets, his face pale but smiling when he saw her. "Hello, wife," he said weakly. "Miss me?" Clara wanted to hit him and hug him at the same time. She climbed into the wagon bed, careful not to jostle him, and took his hand in both of hers. "You got yourself shot, you impossible man." "Only a little bit shot," Preston protested, but he winced as the wagon hit a bump. "It looks worse than it is, I promise. Doc says I will be back on my feet in a few weeks." Dr. Andrews, riding alongside the wagon, cleared his throat. "What I actually said was that you would be recovered enough to start light activity in a few weeks, provided the wound does not get infected, and you follow my instructions to the letter. Which means bed rest, lots of fluids, and absolutely no riding or heavy work for at least a month." Preston made a face, but did not argue, which told Clara exactly how much pain he was actually in. With Thomas's help, they got Preston into the cabin and settled into bed, Dr. Andrews carefully checking the bandages and examining the wound before pronouncing himself satisfied with how it was healing. He was lucky, the doctor told Clara quietly while Preston dozed. Another few inches and that bullet would have hit something important. As it is, he just needs time and rest. Keep the wound clean, watch for signs of fever or infection, and do not let him overdo it even when he starts feeling better. Men always think they are invincible. "I will keep him in bed if I have to tie him down," Clara said with feeling, and Dr. Andrews chuckled. "Somehow I believe you would. He is in good hands, Mrs. Hardy. Send word if anything changes or if you need me." The weeks that followed were challenging in new ways. Preston was not a good patient, chafing at the restrictions and trying to do more than he should. Clara found herself constantly redirecting him, bringing him books to read and asking him to help with small tasks that could be done from bed, like mending harnesses or going over the ranch accounts with Thomas. Danny, now 4 months old and increasingly alert, proved to be good medicine, and Preston spent hours holding his son, telling him stories about the ranch and the horses, and all the things they would do together when Danny was older. "You are going to teach him to ride," Preston said one afternoon, his hand resting on Danny's small back as the baby drowsed on his chest. "I want him to learn from his mother first, so he understands that skill is not about strength, but about patience and understanding." "I do not know if I am qualified to teach anyone anything about horses," Clara protested. I barely know how to ride myself. Then we will both learn together, and Danny can have 2 amateur teachers instead of 1 expert one. That builds character." Preston smiled up at her, and Clara marveled at how even pale and injured, he could still make her heart skip beats. "I love you, Clara Hardy. Have I mentioned that today? Only twice. You are slipping in your old age. Well then, I love you. 3rd time is the charm." His expression grew more serious. "When I was lying there after I got shot, before the doc got to me and I did not know how bad it was, all I could think about was you and Danny. How angry I was that I might not get to see him grow up, that I might leave you alone. It made me realize that I cannot keep doing this deputy work, not now that I have a family depending on me." Clara sat down carefully on the edge of the bed. "Preston, I would never ask you to give up something that matters to you. You are not asking, I am choosing. There is a difference." Preston shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. "I talked to Sheriff Coleman before we got back to Williams, told him I was done after this. He understood, said he had been expecting it. The ranch needs me anyway, and Thomas could use the help. It is time for me to focus on building something here, something lasting for our family." Tears pricked at Clara's eyes, relief and love washing over her in equal measure. She had been so afraid of losing him, and the thought that he would be safer now, staying close to home, made something tight in her chest finally loosen. "Are you sure? I do not want you to resent me or Danny for making you give up that life. I could never resent you, either of you. This is not giving something up, Clara. It is choosing something better." Preston reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Besides, I have had enough excitement for one lifetime. Now I want peace. I want to watch my son grow up. I want to make more babies with my beautiful wife. I want to wake up every morning knowing that the biggest danger I face is whether the cattle have broken through the fence again. That sounds pretty good to me." Clara leaned down and kissed him softly. "That sounds pretty good to me too." Preston recovered slowly but surely, and by the time winter set in, he was back to full strength, working alongside Thomas and their father to manage the ranch. He was home for dinner every evening, there to help Clara with Danny, present in a way he had not quite been able to be when he was regularly riding with the sheriff. The change was good for all of them, and Clara watched their family life deepen and strengthen as the months passed. Danny grew from infant to toddler, taking his first steps in the spring and speaking his first word, which was not mama or dada but horse, much to everyone's amusement. Rebecca had another baby, a little girl named Sarah, and the Hardy family continued to expand and flourish. Life was not always easy. Ranching was hard work and money was often tight, but they were building something solid and real together. On a warm evening in June, exactly 1 year after Danny's birth, Clara stood in the doorway of their cabin watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in shades of orange and gold. Preston came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy anniversary of becoming parents," he murmured. "Has it really been a whole year? It feels like just yesterday I was in labor cursing your name." Preston laughed. "I remember. You were very creative with your cursing. I learned some new words that day." He turned her around to face him, his expression growing more serious. "Clara, this year with you and Danny, it has been the best year of my life. Even getting shot was worth it because it brought me home to you permanently. I would not change a single thing." "Not even the part where you almost died?" Clara asked dryly. "Okay, maybe I would change that part, but everything else stands." He kissed her softly. "I love you, Clara Hardy. I loved you the moment you looked up at me from that Mercantile floor covered in brown paper and twine. I loved you when you said yes to the church social. I loved you on our wedding day and the day Danny was born and every single day in between. and I will love you for the rest of my life." Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks, happy tears this time. "I love you too, so much." You know what the funny thing is? I came west thinking I needed to be independent, that I did not need anyone. But what I actually needed was to find someone who made me want to be interdependent, to build something together instead of trying to do everything alone. You taught me that, Preston. You taught me that needing someone does not make you weak, it makes you human. Well, I am glad I could be useful for something besides terrible puns and getting shot. Preston wiped away her tears with his thumbs, cradling her face in his hands. "What do you say we go inside and celebrate? I believe there is pie left over from supper, and I will even let you have the last piece." "Now that is true love," Clara said with a laugh, but she let him lead her inside, back to their small cabin that somehow held everything that mattered. The years that followed brought changes and growth in ways both expected and surprising. 2 years after Danny's birth, Clara gave birth to twin daughters, Rose and Ruth, who immediately threw the household into delighted chaos. Preston was overwhelmed and overjoyed in equal measure, declaring that he was officially outnumbered by females, and he would have to teach Danny extra well in the ways of surviving life with strong-minded women. The cabin was expanded twice to accommodate their growing family, eventually becoming a proper house with 4 bedrooms and a real parlor. Clara started a small business from home, sewing custom dresses and alterations for the women of Williams, finding that she enjoyed the work and appreciated having something that was hers separate from being a wife and mother. Preston supported this venture wholeheartedly, often taking charge of the children so Clara could work uninterrupted. When Danny was 6 and the twins were 4, another son joined the family, a quiet baby they named Samuel who looked like Clara but had Preston's thoughtful nature. And 2 years after that came their youngest, another daughter named Hope, who was born during a rare summer thunderstorm and seemed to carry that wild energy with her from day one. The Hardy ranch prospered under the combined efforts of Preston and Thomas, their father eventually retiring and leaving the operation to his sons. Rebecca remained Clara's closest friend, and their children grew up together more like siblings than cousins, a tight-knit clan of Hardys who ran wild over the ranch property and kept everyone constantly busy. On a crisp autumn evening in 1895, Clara and Preston sat on the porch of their house watching the sunset while their 5 children played in the yard. Danny, now 14, was teaching his younger brother Samuel how to rope a fence post. The twins were having an animated argument about something while Hope, at 6 years old, was attempting to climb a tree despite repeated warnings about her dress getting dirty. "Should we intervene?" Preston asked, nodding toward Hope's climbing adventure. "Probably," Clara admitted, but neither of them moved. There was something perfect about this moment, the golden light, the sound of children's laughter, the sense of peace that came from years of building a life together. "Preston, do you ever think about that day at the Mercantile? About how everything could have gone differently?" "Sometimes. If the Riley gang had picked a different day or a different town, if I had not had the courage to talk to you, if you had said no when I asked to court you." Preston reached for her hand, a gesture so familiar after 14 years of marriage that it was like breathing. "But then I think about everything we would have missed, and I cannot imagine a world where we did not find each other. We were meant to be, Clara. I believe that. So do I." Clara squeezed his hand. "You know, that cowboy swagger of yours has not diminished with age. Do you remember what you said to me once, something about wrapping parcels?" Preston laughed. "I do not think I ever said anything particularly clever about parcels. That was not my strong suit." "No, but you could have. You could have said something like, "Wrap your arms around me" instead. Clara smiled at the thought. That would have been forward but effective. "Wrap your arms around me instead," Preston repeated, testing the words. "You know what, I like that." He stood and pulled Clara to her feet, ignoring the interested looks from their children. "Clara Hardy, stop thinking about Parcels and wrap your arms around me instead." "You are ridiculous," Clara said, but she was already moving into his embrace, feeling his arms come around her, solid and sure and exactly where she wanted to be. "Mama and Papa are being mushy again," Rose announced loudly, which made Ruth giggle and Samuel roll his eyes. "That is because they are in love," Danny said with the authority of his teenage years. "You will understand when you are older." "I am never falling in love," Hope declared from her perch in the tree. "It makes you act silly." Preston called up to her. "You say that now, little miss, but just you wait. One day some young man is going to sweep you off your feet and you will be just as silly as your mama and me." "Never," Hope insisted, but she was grinning as she said it. Clara rested her head against Preston's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on her face. This was her life now, so different from what she had imagined all those years ago in Jefferson City, so much better than anything she could have planned. She had come west looking for independence and found partnership instead. She had been wrapping parcels at a Mercantile when a cowboy had walked in and changed everything with his concern and his honesty and his steady, enduring love. "Thank you," she whispered to Preston, soft enough that only he could hear. "For what? For choosing me, for loving me, for giving me this beautiful, chaotic, perfect life." Preston kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for saying yes, to the church social, to marrying me, to all of it. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Clara Hardy, and I thank God every day that Bill Riley and his gang decided to rob that bank." Clara laughed at the absurdity of being grateful for attempted robbery, but she understood what he meant. Sometimes the worst moments led to the best outcomes. Sometimes danger and chaos cleared the way for love and peace. Sometimes you just had to trust that the universe knew what it was doing, even when nothing made sense. As the sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky faded from gold to purple to deep blue, Clara and Preston called their children inside for supper. There was the usual chaos of getting 5 active youngsters washed up and seated, the familiar routine of passing dishes and settling arguments and coaxing Hope into eating her vegetables. But underneath, the chaos was love, deep and abiding and real, the kind of love that weathered storms and celebrated joys and grew stronger with each passing year. Later that night, after the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, Clara and Preston lay in their bed talking in low voices about everything and nothing, the way they had done for 14 years. They discussed ranch business and the children's schooling. They laughed about Hope's tree-climbing adventure and worried a bit about Danny growing up so fast. They made plans for the coming winter and dreamed about the distant future when their children would have children of their own. "We are going to be grandparents someday," Clara said, the realization both strange and wonderful. "Can you imagine us with grandchildren? I can hardly imagine us with 5 children of our own, and yet here we are." Preston pulled her closer, tucking her head under his chin. "But yes, I can see it. Danny will probably give us our first grandchild. He has already got that look of a boy who is going to marry young. And the twins will have to coordinate their weddings so neither of them feels left out. Samuel will marry some quiet, sensible girl who balances him out. And Hope, she will probably fall for some wild cowboy who matches her energy. Like her father matched her mother's, exactly like that." Preston was quiet for a moment, and then he said softly, "Clara, I need you to know something. If I died tomorrow, I would die a happy man. Not because I am ready to go, I want many more years with you and the children, but because this life we have built together, it is more than I ever dared to hope for. You have made me happier than I ever thought possible." Clara felt tears stinging her eyes. "Do not talk about dying. We are going to grow old together, Preston Hardy. We are going to see our children married and our grandchildren born, and maybe even our great-grandchildren if we are very lucky. We are going to rock on that porch and tell stories about the old days and drive each other crazy in the way only people who have been married for 50 years can." "That sounds perfect," Preston said. "Let us do exactly that." And they did. They grew old together in their house on the Hardy Ranch, watching their children grow and thrive and eventually start families of their own. Danny married at 20 and gave them 3 grandsons. The twins married brothers, which solved the coordination problem nicely, and between them produced 4 more grandchildren. Samuel found his quiet, sensible wife just as Preston had predicted, and they had 2 daughters who inherited their father's thoughtful nature. And Hope, true to form, fell head over heels for a cowboy with wild energy and a good heart, giving Clara and Preston 5 more grandchildren to dote on. Through it all, through the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and challenges, Clara and Preston remained each other's constant. They weathered droughts and good years, deaths and births, the changing times that saw the Wild West gradually tamed and transformed. They saw Arizona become a state, saw automobiles replace horses, saw the world change in ways they could never have imagined back in 1881. But some things remained constant. Every year on their anniversary, Preston would find Clara wherever she was and say, "Wrap your arms around me instead," and she would laugh and do exactly that. They never tired of each other's company, never stopped finding new things to talk about, never stopped being grateful for the chance encounter that had brought them together. On their 50th wedding anniversary in 1931, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and a growing number of great-grandchildren, Clara and Preston renewed their vows in the same church where they had married half a century before. Clara was 73 now, her honey-colored hair gone silver, and Preston was 76, still straight-backed but moving more carefully than in his cowboy days. But when they looked at each other, they saw the same people they had always been, the young woman who had been wrapping parcels and the young man who had come to check on her after a gunfight. "I would do it all again," Preston said during his toast at the anniversary celebration. "Every single moment, every decision that led me to this woman. Clara Hardy, formerly Clara Greene, you are my heart and my home. You wrapped up my life in ways I never could have imagined, and I am the luckiest man who ever lived." Clara, crying happy tears, stood and took his hand. "And I would choose you again, every single time. You taught me that love is not about losing your independence. It is about choosing to build something together that is stronger than what you could build alone. You are my partner, my best friend, my great love. Here is to 50 more years." "I will settle for 50 more days at our age," Preston joked, which earned him a swat from Clara and laughter from everyone present. But they had more than days. They had years still, good years filled with love and family, and the kind of contentment that comes from a life well lived. They died within hours of each other, Preston in the morning and Clara in the evening of the same day in 1935, as though neither could bear to exist in a world without the other. They were buried side by side in the Williams Cemetery, their joined headstone reading simply Hardy, beloved parents and grandparents. Their children and grandchildren told stories about them for generations, about the cowboy and the mercantile girl who fell in love during a bank robbery, who built a life and a family against the backdrop of the Wild West, who showed through their example what real love looked like, patient, and enduring and true. They told about Preston's terrible puns and Clara's sharp wit, about their unwavering support for each other, about how they had created a legacy not just of children and grandchildren but of love itself, passed down through the generations. And sometimes, on quiet Arizona evenings when the sun sets in shades of gold and orange, you can almost imagine you hear it, a cowboy's voice calling out to his love, "Wrap your arms around me instead," and the sound of laughter in response, warm and familiar and eternal as the land itself.